So we're going to start with just a couple of images. If you're not familiar with Henri Matisse, um, some of you heard of Cézanne. We saw him recently. Matisse took what Cézanne did and then pushed it even further. So Matisse recognizes Cézanne as his master. And when he saw what he was doing with planes of color, he said, wow, this is the way. Matisse is famous for developing a style that really pushed the boundaries, and he might have been one of the first pioneers in true abstraction, not necessarily abstract art, but the application of color to imply breaking absolutely all the rules. Obviously, he's post-Van Gogh, post-impressionist, beyond impressionist. If you define him in a category, they called him Fauvist, and he was part of a group that were called the Fauve, which means wild beasts, savages, because of what they were doing with color. And one of the first images I want to show you is this one here. So, wow. A green stripe down the middle of a woman's face in a portrait that had never been done before. Adding purples, and obviously Van Gogh had some of that pointillism type application of color next to the complementary to imply the values and the shadows, but it was never done this way, with this type of attacking the canvas. And especially when you see the backgrounds, it's just plain blotches of color. And if you're familiar, we're starting to look at red and green. And then of course that green stripe, which is almost like a lime, neon lime, with the red that follows somewhat on the forehead and right behind her neck. It was never, we might be familiar to stuff like this and beyond it, but at the time, this was shocking. This was truly shocking to the world of art. So we're gonna look a little bit at this, and today we're gonna be working with portraits. So I am not really focusing this into an art history session. Just wanted to give you the basics. And I'm just kind of dissecting what would be the best things we could take from our friend Henri Matisse that we learned from, and take one or two, because it's just too much, really. If you look at his work through his life, you could spend a lifetime really studying it. And I have, and I still do, and I still learn new things. As I did this class, I just fall in love all over it again, and then discover new things. And always there's more and more stuff coming out that just adds on to it. So we're just gonna focus on portraiture. For us, for our theme, we're gonna focus on portrait. What can I do with portrait? So, warning, the challenge today is going to be maybe severe for some of you. For all of us, really, if I have one goal for today, is I want you to remember what it was like to be a child and have a crayon in your hand. Now that's like, what? That's impossible. It feels silly. But there is an absolute freedom, and that's what he basically brought to the world of art. A true looking back at the absolute basics, essentials, and you look at it through all of his themes: still life, portrait, landscape. It's stunning. And we're gonna look at basically this. So what I want you guys to do first is, if you don't need watercolor paper for this, you just need a sketch pad or just plain paper. We are going to do 10 portraits in the style of Matisse, sort of a warm up. We're not gonna time them, but we're going to try to keep them under a minute or two. And I'm going to work with you through what it would take to simplify your line. And as I said earlier, this might be a big challenge for us today, as far as laying down a line and wanting to criticize it right away. So the idea today is to really absolutely discover a way to have fun with simplicity of lines. So for this first one here, I'm actually going to use several tools. The first one I'm going to use is this brush pen. So if you have a brush and ink, you know, regular India ink, if you have that, you could use a nib. I recommend a small brush. If you have just any type of pen, that would work fine as well. And I guess for the first exercise, I'm going to do a progression. So I'm going to do pencil. And again, noticing your grip and making a decision on how big we're going to make this portrait. I maybe want to fit 4. I'm going to try to fit 4 or 5 on this page. And since we're going to be doing 10, so that would be 2 pages. So for the first one, I'm going to do pencil. And here's the key. Since we're not looking at a model, we're looking at a drawing. But if I were looking at a model, not a picture, but a live model, what are the elements that I'm going to be focusing on? So this is not necessarily a blind contour drawing. The type of drawing that I want you guys to focus on here is really reading the simplicity of a form. And you can actually look at your drawing. So as you lay your line, you're memorizing the form that you just looked at and laying it down. I might have made that too small. Now, some of these forms, this is not what we're used to seeing them. We're not worried about proportion here. But for example, this nose, I know there's some tiny, subtle curvatures. And notice that how that kind of looks like an S, sort of a simplified number 5 or an S. That would help us begin to see things in a different way and still give us the illusion, and more than that, the abstraction, the representation, and the likeness of, in this case, a portrait, a person. There we are. So this was with pencil. I'm going to write here, pencil. I'm going to switch really quick to a pen for the next one. And we're going to notice a subtle change in the pose, a little bit in the angle. And the same thing, I am looking at the drawing, I'm visualizing a person, not the drawing. I'm memorizing the curvature of this form, making decision on the size, following some of these small, subtle curves with looseness and somewhat freedom. It's not 100% gesture. There's some control to this line. There is a little bit of flow. And again, the idea is to begin to identify which absolute simplified style of line you can begin to develop for your own. I did send a video, and I'm hoping some of you got to see that. If you look closely at how he just scribbled in the eye, the pupils and the iris of the eyes, that would do it for me. Now, for some of us, this might be too, well, this is too basic, too elementary. It's going to be the beginning of something that I think, like I said, it's going to be a challenge once we move forward, but it will remain as a foundation that is only going to help you move this. Because in a way, Matisse took what used to be realism, painting that went in the trend of what we saw with Impressionism to Post-Impressionism. He followed the trend and he took it even further, which in this case was simplified to just these basic lines. I'm going to try my ink brush now. And for this one, oh, we begin to have some of these lines that would begin to hint, and I believe are what kind of pause, cause freeze, and give us second doubt because we consider them somewhat detail lines. And instead of focusing on just the simplicity of the shape of a line, we try to do too much with just more than a C or an S shape with somewhat of a little bit of a gesture, following that curvature, never going back over it, having a good sense before you start your line, a little bit of a sense of, now that I know where it starts, I have an idea of where it's gonna, how it's gonna go and where it's gonna end. As you're doing that, the more you figure that out, the not necessarily faster, but smoother and easier your lines will flow. Having a sense. So that's why our eyes on our model, studying enough. And again, revisit that video if you didn't have a chance to see it. Notice how Matisse himself would look, and sometimes 3, 5, 10 seconds looking at the model. And until he's sure, okay, I got it, it's planned, it's in my mind, then he would fix his eyes on the paper and he would just basically kind of trace it. But it had to be envisioned first. So there we are. And there is a reason why I'm going to use this one from now on, because obviously it matches the look. I might switch to yet another tool, and I'm going to do one more with ink. So I just did 3 here. I'm going to use the same ink brush. So this is ink brush. And it's because of the way you can gesture these lines. So I'm going to make this one a little bit bigger. And here's what I mean. Today is going to be more of a challenge of your perception of what your art is supposed to look like. And to just accommodate yourself to having fun and realizing that, oh my goodness, I could do so much more with this type of simplicity of line and then build on it. I want to point a little bit to this neck here, just that beautiful alignment and direction of line here. But realizing what you're capable of doing with these beautiful flowy lines and how you can develop these into just amazing pieces of artwork. And again, this is somewhat of a warm-up exercise, pointing us into the exercises that we're going to be doing today. I'm going to move a little bit faster here. Okay, so for this one, I'm going to go to charcoal. And it might be just a sepia, one of these sepia pencils, a sanguine. And same process. I'm looking at my model. I'm defining the form. I'm planning it out. I'm getting a sense. Mapping it out is what I call it. And then I'm just going to, with confidence, somewhat gesture it in. Getting that good sense. Where I begin, where I end is a matter of your mental planning, really. It shows us a little bit what you're more fixated on. Most of us would kind of want to start with the eyes. That's fine. For me, developing the shape and getting a sense of the rhythm of the lines because these are not my original. I'm basically trying to copy his movement of his hand, and you could kind of see it. You could also begin to see the speed of some of these lines. But you could almost really begin to read where they started and where they ended and how they ended with just a little flick. Making sure our proportion is somewhat there, just matching the likeness here. These beautiful shapes that give us somewhat of a symbolic representation of the eye, but within it, the shape, in this case, for this model, it matches. It is the absolute simplified form. And this is another way of maybe drawing a nose that is not so much 3/4, but more front view. And how we develop these lines and keep them simplified to create a beautiful simplified portrait. And these are amazing. Now the size, the actual size of these are more on the 14-inch, 18-inch format. I would venture to say I don't think I've ever seen one that's less than 11 inches. So it's somewhat of that sketchbook where you would just gesture out. It does make a difference. Obviously, the bigger you work, the more flow your lines are going to have. So I'm going to write here sanguine. And I'm going to switch my page. So our next one is, again, trying to, let's see. So I'm going to use a charcoal pencil for this one. And this is the Cretacolor. Switch my page. And as we begin to see somewhat, there's a big difference between this one and the first one. To pay attention to what amount of detail we are trying to add to these drawings. So I'm going to try to make this one a lot bigger. Now I really have to get a good sense of the full shape. So once again, it's not a blind contour drawing, but it's in a way memorizing, mapping it out, and then having that confidence to create that line. You're never going to be off. It's getting rid of that fear of having to be exact in terms of likeness. This is the first stage to begin to develop really the way you observe, the way you make a decision with actually one of the hardest things to draw, which is a human portrait. These very subtle, I encourage you to look very closely at these subtle curvatures, especially on the structure of the nose, would-be nose. First one, first eye that kind of develops an eyelid here, the little scribble. The direction on which the line starts and ends, for example, on this eye or this eyebrow. It does make a difference. Doesn't make a difference if I start here and end here, or start here and end here. In his drawing, which one would you guess? Well, it looks like he started here and went in. So it does make a little bit of a difference in terms of the look of that line. And then these very subtle curvatures that give us even a little bit of a character to the portrait, that tiny faint smile. So there we are. And again, because it is a little bit larger, it felt a little bit easier for me. And then the things you could do with this are extraordinary. I think we're going to skip this one just to move ahead for time. Let's go to this one. I'm also going to make it a little bit bigger. I'm going to use a different type of charcoal here. I'm going to be using my Conte pencil, HB, a little bit longer. And again, testing yourself with what kind of grip are we using here. For different mediums, sometimes we do use different grips. Test out using a continuous mechanic and see what happens. Give yourself a little more looseness, looking a little bit more for that accidental, beautiful line that maybe had somewhat intention, but then a little bit of giving up control. Okay, so again, here I see a lot more likeness. There's a little more of that mental process that I want you guys to be aware of in terms of, because there's a lot more, feels like more detail, it somewhat freezes me to pay attention. I just want to go back to simplified, memorized, curved lines. With no hesitation, total freedom. Big important line here, of course, to recognize this with somewhat of that curvature and meeting some of those curvatures and the angle of those lines as well. The beauty of it is how simple it appears, but there's so much information in just the hints of some of these lines. And believe it or not, the thickness, like I mentioned before, the direction, there we are. So I saved the best for last. And as we come into here, I might make a quick mental read on proportion. Make sure I have a good space, and just making sure as we look at a model, and if we were to have this model in front of us, to be able to simplify these types of forms into these subtle curved shaped lines. And you really begin to get a sense of how Matisse was looking at things, how he made that decision. If you can really visualize this woman's face and how it would look in reality, and how you now are making that decision to turn this, what we know, left eye, into just that simplified shape. All of these lines that would represent not just her hair, but her hairstyle. And get a joy out of it. We're moving to the next one. Ooh, interesting. I'm going to go back to, if you haven't, try different. If you have a pen, pencil, charcoal, I'm hoping you have tried different ones. If you haven't, we have 2 left. Go ahead, do that now. Now, if you have a pen or an ink brush, it will require more commitment, more confidence as you lay down, because notice, we don't erase, we don't go over the line. Once we lay it down, that's pretty much it. And with these type of profiles, there is that beautiful, subtle read of the line that basically gives you all of the information in one pass. So there is a chance to miss your mark. And again, that's only you. Mentally, you're looking at no judging, but paying attention very closely to what you're looking at, how you're seeing it, how you're mapping it, and then how you're translating it here. What is the process from looking, pausing, and then laying it down? I like this one. Give you guys a couple more seconds. These are beautiful. The profiles, really love them. They're so subtle. Okay. And last one. So we're gonna add a couple more levels of information. For this one, I might go back to my charcoal. And now we're adding elements of the body, a shoulder, a hand, forearms, some clothes, some textile here at the bottom, some folds basically. And again, making your decisions. How am I going to compose this page? What kind of lines, and mapping it out. I'm going to start right here. Some of us, if we're used to it, whether we want to or not, will begin to look at negative space in order to read. And that eventually is the way to do it. To have a sense of all of the read of the line and not pausing. Notice that he's going through one read as he's mapping, so it's semi-blind contour for this one in order to get the right read and the curvature of some of these lines. And I decided to go for where I know is going to position me with a more accurate description, which is this hand here. And if I get away with that there, I should be okay. It defines pretty much the structure for all others as I come in and just lay down simple curved lines that allow me to position the start of the next and be able to very relaxed, but very focused. There's a level of focus for these drawings where you're splitting your attention between what is and how you're translating it. So that's what I mean by pay attention, be aware of how it's coming from what you see and that step from how you're seeing it with your eyes, in your mind, and then onto the paper. That stage, that step, what is happening? Is it slowing down? Am I rushing? Am I skipping some of the information? Am I making it up? Am I giving myself too much freedom to develop my own line? So this is a nice one here, just a little squiggle for the nose. And I made that mistake again. No mistakes, but the start rushed a little. I could actually see if I wanted to imitate the look a little closer. Where he chose to start his line, you can actually see it And I love it. Just a quick exercise to give yourself some expression with simple lines and still be able to capture that likeness. Okay, so are you guys ready for the next step? I'm gonna turn my page, and I do love them when they are this size. A little bit bigger might even be more interesting to experiment with. But this feels perfect for this type of exercise. Okay, so for our next one, here's my challenge to you guys. You're gonna select a tool, pencil, charcoal, pen, ink brush, anything you've worked with, anything you can think of. Some of you might be thinking, "Ooh, I might just go with brush and watercolor and just create some beautiful watercolor lines." So here's what we're gonna do for this next one. Same thing. So everything we've been doing now that was given to us, we're going to try to find it. And again, we have a photograph. We are going to make a quick observation of the form, some of the shapes. Now, we've had a good warm-up to realize how many lines does it take to put together a portrait? Somewhere between 1 and 10, I would say. And what are the absolute essential forms, curvatures of those lines that would capture this portrait? So that's what we're going to try to do. I'm going to use my charcoal pencil, one of my favorite tools ever, and make a decision on my size. And once again, and I'm going to do this for you guys. Just again, I'm going to give you guys a couple minutes for this one, but I could go this way, and I'm going to try to just, again, what do you call it? When you invoke Matisse, and pretty much just go for, and I'm going to go all the way back. To the first one we did, which, as you remember, was just a couple of lines. And again, this has a little bit more of a frontal view. That was more of a 3/4. And be okay with that. If you guys remember that first one we saw, to really try to simplify your forms. But I'm going to go with the evolution that we were following and map out and gesture. Oh, sorry. Was I muted for a second there? Something happened. I'm sorry. Okay, we're back. Okay, so what I'm trying to do is, again, formalizing, continuing with the progression that we were working with. So much information. What am I going to choose as my specific? And here's where we could get easily lost. Where we add too much information and then realize how much is too much. But in order to capture, we need sufficient information and really begin to see how he saw it. So I think that does a really good job for me, for the hair. There's a nice curvature to this eyebrow and a little bit of a thickness here. And again, I'm not trying to begin to draw like I usually draw. I'm continuing to simplify and remember how he used some of these curves and just basically resolved the forms there we are. And again, this takes a lot of practice. I might have been better off using a smoother tool. Okay, I hope everybody's, again, sketching. We're not creating finished portraits here. These are sketches. Let's go to our next one. And I picked somewhat familiar faces because in case you didn't know, the more familiar the face is to the artist, the harder it is for you to disconnect what you think you know about the information of that person's face and simplify it. So again, because we know this face, already that's kind of a speed bump. We need to get over it and just absolutely begin to look at the information that we need in order to resolve the gesture, the drawing that we want to create. So I'm going to go with an ink brush here. And again, looseness. Difference of thickness in the line, but making sure you map it out before. In your mind, map it out before you lay it down. Very interesting thing happening here with the eyebrow. So making a decision, how do I bring this line? So take as long as you need in order to resolve it. And remember, you want to simplify. And that's pretty much the goal for today. How far can you push simplicity? Oops, very subtle lines here. And still walk away with a quick gesture portrait that has some likeness, showing you which lines are the essential components of the form that you're looking at. Let's try one last one. Another familiar face. And I'm also, once again, going to go with the ink brush. Or just a brush dipped in ink. And begin to really get a good sense of my map. Some beautiful lines here. And again, remember, we're looking for essence, simplicity. think I went too fast here because I love this curve here. So there we go. And again, it's channeling was the word I was looking for. Channeling Matisse. I'm going to, once again, try to resolve some of these. Remember the type of line that he was able to use in order to resolve some of this without the feel, the need to add what we would consider detail. Now this one here. Really look and try to just capture that basic elemental shape that could be described with just a simple line. Don't rush through it. Took this one a little too far. And maybe even for some reason, I'm getting a little bit of a Birth of Venus vibe to the neck here. Botticelli's. So there we are. These type of portraits, and again, if we're having somewhat, I'm gonna switch camera here. If we feel like we're having some kind of, nope, I'm not happy, it's not where I want to be, realize that it is in the mental process. It's how you're saying and how you're translating that is probably not letting you get satisfaction from it. So how do we resolve that? Simplify it even more. Usually you are trying to add too much detail, too much likeness. That generally starts pushing it in the opposite direction that where we want to go today. As always, itching to see some of these. And I'm going to pause really quick. If you guys could, please pick your favorite and just put it up to the screen. I'm going gallery view. And I'm going to pick my favorite too and put it up. So we have, oh, wow. Give me 1 second so I can take a good look. And I think this was my favorite. Let's see. Oh, wow. Okay, so I'll put this one up. And let's see. And we're waiting for Anne. There's Anne. Oh, wow. Yay. Great job, everybody. Okay, so we get it. And this, again, understanding that, let me see, how do I spotlight again? There we go. So the key here is understanding that you are the boss. You get to say what goes. And this, and even further than this, take this information and run with it. It is okay for you to do anything with these lines, and this is how maybe it's supposed to look like. That's what Matisse did. He said, here, that's what I want to do with color and line, and this is how I'm going to present a portrait. Now, he did have stages. So here I'm going to have a little quick run through, just basic information. Notice how simplified a portrait is. And again, a little bit into art history. If we're going 10, 20, 30 years back, there is huge. It would be like not having internet to today. That kind of a break. From never ever knowing what internet was to having social media and iPhones, basically. That's what I think would feel like the break that happened here with representation of a portrait and what he did with color. Kept pushing it even further. So this is one of the ones we're going to come back to, and we're going to try this with color, this same exact one. Notice lines, they're a little more geometric. There's a break. Now he's representing light and shadow with just two simple colors. But if you are aware of color theory, you're recognizing that, whoa, there's yellow, orange, blue. Those are all part of the complementary scheme. And then this green, gray, how is that making this work? Is it working for you? Some of you might find this, meh, I don't like it. Well, if we were to change the color scheme, which colors would you apply in this technique, in this method, to make that work for you? This is a portrait of his daughter, Marguerite, which actually he gave to Picasso. They were very good friends. They were it. They were, I don't know how to put this. In tennis, I guess they were Federer and Nadal, or Federer and Djokovic. When it comes to art, they were it. They were number one and number two. And they had this little battle because they were pushing the ideas of Cézanne. So one of them was going to be the one. And then, of course, most people would say, well, Picasso won because he took more risks and did so much more with. But many people would say, well, no, Matisse took it way further if you look at the entire. But again, it's open for debate. Who's the greatest? This is one portrait where, again, you look at the lines, you look at the descriptive details of the face, but color. Look at the background. Look at the solid patches of color on the dress, on the face, on the cheeks. We're also going to be looking at this one, the description of the hair, green hair. This is, again, first time. For us, it might seem natural because actually I have seen people with green hair. Maybe this is where it comes from. And then we're going to venture a little bit further into, okay, what is he doing now with patterns in the backgrounds? Notice the simplicity of application of color. The line is almost like a ghost in there now. It's all about the supporting actor. The background is becoming the star. The lines kind of get lost, but we see a figure, but the background, the stage, is actually taking more focus here. There's also an application of more, in this case, they're analog colors. When you look at the scheme of the blue-gray, the pop of red and green, of course, but they're a little more muted. They're working together. And again, the simplicity, when you look at the face, hair, and hands, especially the hands, it took maybe 30 seconds to do that, just 5 brush strokes. And that's not, again, not what we're going for. Focusing, again, on how he's using color to define the shapes of the figure and the background. We will be coming back to these, okay? Now, adding elements such as a basic background with red and white stripes, whatever that is, the type of ornamental, decorative. And he did use this a lot because some people say where he was born in the north of France, where it's all textiles. So in his childhood, he was surrounded by patterns and decorative ornamental patterns of textile, which he then, if you look at the curtains and some of the scenes that we're getting to, it is all about that. How textiles, patterns, backgrounds. This one, of course, we see a little bit of plants, organic forms, the greens, and how they develop sort of a middle ground background with the white in the background. And again, always those patterns. Breaking a little bit, which would seem more into developing the color, not as plain blocks, but broken. And it kind of goes back to revisit the original style that we were looking at first in these early ones. And I'm going to hint to it again really quick. Like, nope, not that one. Like these, but with more adventure in the background. Just a little more adventure in the background. And of course, the brush strokes and the experiments that he's doing with the application and mixing of the color on the canvas is a little bit different, which is another thing we could experiment with today. pushing the background to simplicity, just a plain violet. But notice that the background, what we would assume is a wall behind her and the chair and the table, are one and the same. So there is no read of perspective. Well, if the table and the wall were the same color, some effects of light would differentiate the angle of it. But here, it's simplifying everything to just one wash of color and saying how that is absolutely okay to do. And we're gonna definitely do that today. And then of course, pushing it even further to more and more decorative patterns. Some of you are really gonna like this. And I'm hoping because of the simplicity and the portraits that we're gonna make, maybe go for more decorative patterns in your backgrounds. And again, whether it's geometric, arabesque, some of them, you know, Arabic type patterns. He did travel through North Africa, Morocco, all the way around the world, really. He was a traveler, New York, Tahiti, and picking up just what can I use? And how can I develop these even further? I picked this one because if you look at the figure, there's not even a face. So I'm talking about that level of simplicity. We didn't even bother to add the line, the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 lines for the eyes and nose and mouth. This one is completely blank, but then you begin to have all the decorative patterns with the plants. He was very adventurous in using black and was one of the ones that, because with the Impressionists, black was gone. You don't use black. Here, he brings it back and calls it one of the absolute masterful colors to use. When he did not know what color to use, he used black. That was his quote. And again, just showing you a few of these. I love showing this one because again, it's just an interior scene. There's a window, but all of the patterns reflected in the mirror, the way he describes, you know, the still life, the ornaments, the sculpture on the wall, the paintings on the wall, it all becomes sort of a one plane, if you guys could see that. It's all just juxtaposed. So he's playing with juxtaposition of color and patches of color in decorative ornaments. So if you look at some of these, we're gonna be trying to use some of these as we develop these portraits. So let's go back to the first one here. Now, if you have some mixed media paper, and I will be using hot press today. I did some sketches earlier. So you can see here, just reproducing somewhat of, oh, I did some of these with the early ones with color as well. You know, I said, why not? And there's some good experiments there. And beginning to do some of the patterns to see how that would work. So what I want you guys to do is on a full page, you know, and again, I'm saying, I want you guys to make sure you have enough room to play with some of the techniques. And you are welcome to use not just watercolor, but color pencil or any other medium that you want to play with that feels comfortable. If you're working with watercolor, and I am, to play with some of the techniques of application. So wet on wet, flat washes. And we're going to be playing with the edges. So the first thing is, what am I going to do first? The background, the figure, the lines. I almost would want you guys to experiment with this. Where would you start? Would you start with the drawing and then fill in the color shapes? If you were to do that, what medium would you start with? Would you draw it in with a pencil? Are you going to be using watercolor all the way through? Or are you going to work with an ink brush and then work the color sort of in a coloring book system, in a coloring book method? If you have that resolved, I'm going to tell you what I'm going to do. I am going to use ink brush, because this is permanent ink. If you were to use watercolor, you're gonna have to be very careful not to mix and blend as you're coloring some of these shapes of color. So I will do several different ones. For this first one, I am going to use ink brush. So once again, if you wanted to make a nice frame, I'm not going to in this case, You would tape your edges and begin your drawing. Have a good sense of what proportions on the page and how it's going to fit from edge to edge, or you could just rearrange some of these shapes. And again, mapping it out, making a quick decision. What is your center? And a little bit off to the right, I'm going to begin with very simple lines. Making sure I try to capture somewhat of the angle, because there's very subtle angles that kind of develop this portrait. And just lay them down. Make a little bit of triangulation, meaning I compare one point to the other in order to know where I start and stop, to come down. And develop just a sense of play, true child play in terms of your drawing approach. There we go. Some crucial triangular or square shapes that develop, paying attention to the roundness of some of these forms and some of the angles. Some of this that could be developed with color. There we go. And take freedom, take complete liberty in making any changes you feel are necessary for your piece. I'm trying to stay a little accurate in terms of likeness here as best as I can, but I am taking somewhat gesture here with some freedom in terms of how these lines are going to be reproduced. Having a good sense of this curvature here. And how this form would just round out right through the back. Save again, the best for last. Mapping it out. And again, one of the things I love the most is how he just reinterpret the complete likeness of a person, especially with the eyes and the noses, the lips, in such a simple way, with a very subtle read and curvature of the lines. Playing with the thickness of it. But it's mostly in that shift of curvature, the angle, and somewhat the feel of the line, which really just captures it. You kind of have a sense you know this person. You could recognize them if you saw them. And not just that, but again, the sensation of what this person is feeling with the smile or the gesture of the mouth. Okay, so that was a very simple drawing. Gives us a nice setup for, step away for a second. And I will be activating my watercolors. And today is one of these days where it might not be so much about your watercolor mixing techniques. You could mix your colors that are going to be interesting to you. It's going to be more about, and Matisse said it, it's not representing things, it's the way things work in relationship to other things and the color of those things. So picking your color, there we are, and your color scheme. So we're going to completely venture out here. And that's the one thing I'm going to play with, which is I'm not going to follow the same color patterns of the painting. Now that might be difficult to kind of get away from, like, oh no, I just want to try it and go ahead with the same color scheme. That's totally fine. You guys can emulate, go for the simple, close as you can to that orange, green, blue, yellow, and somewhat that gray. And basically replicate. That's totally fine. Once you have the drawing, if you've played with it, you are also completely encouraged to create a different color scheme. Maybe even a different color pattern. But it would be interesting to just see that face with a duality of color there. So this, of course, you would have to plan out. There's a reason why he selected these colors. As I mentioned before, you have that orange and the blue, which create this amazing contrast, where the orange becomes the light and the blue becomes the shadow. And of course, that yellowish orange doubles it. And then the decision of the green, if you look at your color wheel, how it jumps, it might be a triad or a split complementary that maybe skips one step. And I try to figure this out. It could have just been intuition, just, oh, let me put that green in here and see how that goes. It could have easily been, what would happen if the hair was red instead of green? It changes completely. Now it becomes extremely warm. So these small decisions, as you select your colors and as you apply your color, I also want you to begin to think about techniques of application. So I'm going to go really quick to one of these, and I hope, oops, not that one, this one here. Notice how there's a patch of color for the background with dabs, polka dots, squiggly lines, cross grids of color. So all of these different pattern applications. For now, I hope you keep it a little bit simpler, but you could begin to explore what type of application of color, not just what colors, but what type of application of color. Okay, so here we go. As I look at my color palette, that blue is just, ooh. How could I test out? And these would basically be sketch. You could do thumbnails to kind of see which color, and I could do them down here maybe to see which colors are working with next to what they're doing to visually as I place them next to each other. If you're doing that, that's totally fine. What I do want you to stay away from is somewhat those flesh tones, trying to get a little realistic. We're going for basically solid, vibrant, clean colors here. Not necessarily primary. I'm not saying you can't use browns or grays. That's totally fine. Let's see. So the decision, I think the big one for me would be the background. And I'm having a feel that I'm going to warm up the background even more with alizarin crimson. And that is what I'm going to do. So just to add a little more intrigue to this piece, I'm going to spray it just a little bit in the areas where I'm going to be applying that red to see what happens when I dab it on. And again, just watercoloring, making sure I don't want color in certain other areas. I'm not too worried because I was working with that ink brush. This ink is permanent ink, so it should be totally fine to just go over it. Taking your time or doing gesture application of color here as well, totally fine. I want you guys to surprise yourselves. Different techniques of wet on wet, patches of color, different brush strokes, not necessarily fully solid patches of color, but I am going to go for this one here to simplify the background, put more emphasis on the colors in the face. I think just warming this up to extreme. Not necessarily a warm red, but a cool red. Maybe keeping the hair green and see what that does. I could also mix different reds in the background, begin to play with that. And again, remember, this is all about you guys developing a sense of absolute freedom to make the decisions that will get you there. And by there, I mean satisfied. Discovery, places of discovery. So I am going to go with a green for the hair. I might mix it just with a little bit of blue to cool it down even more. And as I lay down my green, I had a thought like, oh, what would this portrait look with just primary colors? Yellow, red, blue, and maybe then make a decision for the shadow. That would be an interesting one. I guess I'll test that out later. And again, that's the kind of thought process that you want to be having, like, oh, what if it was all yellows or oranges and just variations of the warmth or coolness of a scheme of color. So not necessarily monochromatic variations of, again, any color you select. And playing with, again, that type of application. Now, one of the things that I was not able to, and he did not seem to do a lot of, were watercolors, Matisse. He was a busy guy. He was always drawing. That was one of his things. Always drawing and then painting. He kept a schedule that was basically 9 to 5, strict. 9 to noon, lunch, nap, and then back to work. Used a lot of indoor light as well, but mostly not necessarily plein air, but in the studio with daylight. Okay, so while this dries, and I'm making decisions to let areas dry so I don't mix the colors, I'm gonna go, and already it's like, wow, what is this? Red and green, they could not be more complementary. I might go with a little bit of a ultramarine blue and maybe push it with a little bit of violet for the color in the area of the gray. Very simple. Remember, you're keeping it just like you were drawing earlier. Some of that gesture should come through in your application as well. That simplicity. You could see the brush stroke. But again, surprise me. I want to see a lot of, experimenting techniques. Wet on wet is one that just, I could see this developing into some beautiful, beautiful pieces. Okay, we're going into the face now. And for this one, I am going to stick with somewhat of a yellow or a warm orange. So it's a little bit of a new gamboge, and I think that's very close to what was used. So I think I will stick with that. And there we go. And again, just going right over my lines. The way he created this beautiful light and shadow here. And these are also works that you could watercolor first and then develop your lines after. So this is not exactly the technique that I'm saying you have to do it. Remember, you could pencil it in, color it, then work your lines over the color in order to give it a different look, a much more polished, finished look maybe. Because when you watercolor over some pens or inks or even watercolor lines, you will lose a little bit of that vibrancy. And finally, what color should I make this shadow area? So with that red and yellow, I'm just gonna go with a full-on violet. Kind of a purple more than anything. And I'm gonna test it out here first. So it would be sort of a double, almost triple complementary scene here with the yellow purple, yellowish purple, orange blue, and red green, which is what I went for. So that was pushing it way to extremes, and only one way to know if it worked or not, which is to test it out, to do it. And then to have it sit around as you look at it, and it will tell you yes or no. And see what I mean by the lines. As you lose some of this, I could wait till it dries and come back over. Depending on the color you were using, this purple, this violet purple is a little too strong for some of these lines. So once again, what does color do to your lines? And how you use that to your favor. And just to finish up, I will, instead of having this white, we'll add a little bit of a gray here. Kind of neutralize that whole area. So, woo, that is experimenting. And why not? I guess it's step one. One way maybe to do these in a different way would be to divide this page into 4 smaller ones and do quick, just little quick thumbnails with blotches of color to see what kind of experiments you can make with color combinations, color schemes. So I had an idea, and we're really running right at the time, so perfect. I'm gonna give you guys a couple more minutes as I explain where I want us to go next. I emailed you guys several images of a little more finalized portraits. I know I had so many, and again, it's because I love his work so much. I could have gone overboard with emailing you tons of images. But from the ones you have, from the email, I want you guys to pick one. And in that selection, you're going to be making a choice of, okay, well, it's because I love how the figure is developed or the background is developed, something about the colors, maybe the combination of all of them, and implement some of the line, background, color technique that we're exploring today. So it's not necessarily reproducing it, it's getting an inspiration from the image and reinterpreting it with these 3 elements. So looking at the lines, how you develop the line, how you develop the background, and what color scheme you put together to develop your image. So I will start here. This is another simple one. So you could stay in the simple background, more focus on the portrait, or you could go a little more towards the background, lose the portrait, a little more, and I call this not traditional, but in the sense of portraiture, it is a little more traditional with muted colors that are all working together. And then the final one, I think it was this one, where you could experiment with both. And I think I'm gonna do this one as the demo. So revisiting this one, I'm gonna do a drawing, maybe in pencil. It's not fully dry yet, but we move on. I'm gonna start this drawing in pencil, and I'm going to try to somewhat remain, I'm not gonna say faithful to the color scheme, but within that nice purple, violet, green, orange, red, warm, cool background that's happening here. I'm not gonna overdo it with the patterns in the background, more focus on those simplistic gesture lines that give us the patterns on the dress. And I love the hairpiece, the flowers and what you can do there. That would most likely remain the same, that red, pink, white. But it's a very simple portrait that allows you lots of freedom to develop background color schemes, or even the decorative patterns on the blouse, on the shirt. So this is one that I do recommend. If you have a favorite, like I said, go ahead and develop that one. And I'm gonna start, actually for this one, I am gonna create a little frame. So quick taping of the edges. Here we are. That'll give it a nice, much cleaner finished look, because it will be, it will be a little busier what I plan in terms of watercolor application. I want to play with more dabs of color, a little more wet on wet patterns, some strokes, maybe some spatter, maybe some polka dots here and there, some lines. So again, planning ahead. Yep, I want to have a border. Here we are. So I'm going back to pencil for the structure of the drawing, giving myself somewhat pointers, markers in terms of proportion, how big, but I still want to remain with the same sense of play as I develop my drawing. Staying away from detail, just nice, beautiful, curved, simplified lines. All right, so here we go. I'm gonna start a little bit of a blind contour, give myself a little bit of that freedom to develop the hair piece, the flowers on the head, and some of that beautiful line work. Very playful. Actually, it will help enhance, I feel, what the line and the color are gonna do later on. So that worked there. What I do with the neck. And obviously it might not be full proportion in terms of how I prepared my page. So I could take some liberty. Moving to the other side. And I'm doing blind contour here as I just try to reimagine these organic forms, the lines, flowers, edges. Picking up on some of those elements that are key, as I also begin to read what will be very important to this image in terms of how some of these lines and color are working together. A little more looseness and freedom to develop some of these lines. I'm giving myself some markers where I see some of these big patterns to fill up some of these shapes will be very important in terms of where they go. The curvature of some of these lines. Hinting at some of the background, changes in color in the background. It's just beautiful precision what he's doing with all of these elements as he puts them together. Most artists of his time and beyond consider him to be one of his greatest achievements is as a colorist. He really, one of the beautiful descriptions that I hear from Matisse is he had the sun in his heart because everything was just color and light. And he was also of a philosophy of everything is beautiful. You get to choose if you want to focus on the negative. He lived through World War I and World War II. And he volunteered for World War I and they said, nah, you're too old already. So he stayed back and did all these beautiful works. And one of his quotes that I love is, there's always flowers for those who choose to see them. Because again, it was at a time where people were going a little more avant-garde and art was changing so much, and art and film and cinema, everything was taking a little bit of a turn in terms of what is beautiful, surrealism coming along, and everything is absurd. And he said, no, well, I choose to look at the beauty that's out there. So he was criticized a little bit for that. Oh, you're not actually taking a realistic view of life. And he goes, actually, I think I am. And it was very colorful. It was very looking for beauty, the everyday beauty. And with color, it's just amazing. And at the end of his life, the last, I guess, decade, he was not able to paint anymore. I will send you guys a link that I would love for you guys to see to close out this Matisse class, where all he did was cutouts, and he would use scissors and paper, and he made these unbelievable series of paintings from cutouts. All right, so I'm going into the facial features here now. Very loose, very organic drawing. My approach here, I'm having a sense as I draw this that this hair must remain black. Very light lines here. I guess it's the eyebrows and the hair that just work together so well. Some of the shadows on the side of the nose. Very subtle here because, again, it's not simplified like the ones we saw earlier. It is simple, but it's not truly simplified. There's a little bit of shadow work, but notice the eyes. The eyes is just a line and a dot. But the curvature of that eye. There we are. I think I have enough to begin to work with color. So there's my drawing. And again, I gave myself enough clues for variations of color here. And just start thinking about all the things I can do with color in this one. Okay, So I have my color palette ready. And in a way, I do want to take full inspiration from this and see where I'm planning out what stages of color, whether I should start with the background and then after that come over with some of the lines that I'll need to re-emphasize. And that might be a good strategy. Or should I start with the figure and then develop the background? So it's kind of tricky. The figure, somehow gives me a sense that I could work afterwards much easier than if I did with the background. So that is what I will do. I'm going to start with the background. And again, not trying to exactly replicate, but keeping somewhat in a little bit of a faithful scheme to the color, to the color scheme that he chose. I will keep that cool, warm play in the background. So I'm going to mix a nice orange, yellow orange. Clean up my palette a little bit. And I'm going to mix up a cool yellow with a warm red. And create somewhat of a spectrum. Where I can come back and make my color yellower, cooler, or warmer. And that is looking very nice, this orange here. I'm going to lay down some of it, starting right over here on this edge. And again, my type of application here, I am going to create patches of color, and I will revisit once the area is dry with somewhat of a layering. But I want to begin to think of patterns. And you notice all the floral, organic, text, decorative patterns that he used. Here's where you get to be really, really creative. Just line patterns, crossing patterns, and it could be just brush patterns. Here's where I wanted a little bit of a yellower orange, just to fill in some of this area. And again, very simplified approach. Now on this side, I might want to be a little redder, because I think just how this element is applied here, it's beautiful. And the complement of this with the flowers on the right side of her head, it's just amazing. And when you begin to make decisions like this and you're aware of them, that's going to make people so happy. And maybe they'll know why, but that's what makes it work. Balancing some of these colors out. But again, remain in a stage of experimenting. As my paint is maybe still a little bit wet, I will maybe do a little, moist. I will do a little bit of a wet on wet technique up here to create somewhat of a visual pattern of that orange red. No, it's too dry already. But different visual candy, basically. Not just one solid patch of color here. And I kind of begin to like what's going on there. You're welcome to use color straight out of your palette with no mixing, and then create layers or patterns within your layers as you mix your color on the page. As I have this going on here, I'm going to bring it over to this side here and just create somewhat of a layer that I will be coming back to work over, just like I did on that orange patch. And again, this is, once again, how this area of color balances out what I just did on the right side. As you kind of dissect these, and that's why I recommend always, always, as much as you can, study the masters, the ones you like. You'll begin to discover so many solutions that took them years and years in their entire lives to then share, and why we love them still. And we figure why, oh, oops. I'm going to switch cameras really quick. I believe it's that time. Yes, it is. Sorry. Just take 1 second. Here we go. And we're back. So some of these solutions that when you begin to study them in depth, you pick your favorite artists. There's artists that we just love. Why do I love this work so much? And you begin to really dig in and see what are the things that they did that make that work attractive to you. What are the elements that they played with, and how you could maybe use them and take them further. So I'm going to select this area here, and I'll tell you why. The pattern, if you see how this pattern of yellows and lighter yellows and a little bit warmer yellows are surrounding the face, you can see that with the addition of the black, it creates this beautiful frame. And obviously the pops of red, when you look at this painting, it is genius, really, how the shirt is left unfinished. In the sense of unfinished, but still developed where you can recognize the patterns. And what would have happened if it was developed further? It would literally take away so much attention from all the other light areas. So it happens to just be there, but it doesn't detract, and it actually enhances your focus to the subtle areas where you could see these light colors. And I'm going to try to get in just a little bit clearer. And again, making playful decisions on how to apply your color, giving yourself more and more freedom to experiment. This one's going to be a little more solid for me. And I'll explain why in a second. Maybe a little bit of lightness as you come around and closer to the face. But the reason these lines, and you notice on this edge right here, how it circles around and barely hinted, but it encapsulates that the head, the shape, and the flowers. It is this black that creates sort of another layer that makes these colors so much stronger to like pop and come forward. And it just enhances, it forces you to look at this area And of course the eyes, which just because they're eyes are the focal point. The small things you can do to kind of keep the attention and even enhance it there. So I am mixing a little bit of black with, let's see, this Prussian blue. So it's still somewhat of a dark blue, and I don't want to make this black over here, but because of the orange next to it, I want it to be a little bluer, still hinting towards the black, creating that same effect of a background that's pushing all the other colors forward. And I want to begin, because of my style of painting, the one I like, just dabbing the color, mixing on the palette, but then again, a double mix sometimes on the page with these smaller dabs of color. I could begin to just leave areas of white that I could come back to. And as you could see here, just dabbing that color in, letting it dry. And for me, it's very playful. And here I might do a little bit more. I need to add a little bit of green to this blue. Just give it a little variation. I want it somewhat lighter in value, and I'm going to use kind of a hatching pattern, brush strokes here. If you guys could see that, where I could come over later on with a nice layer and create very, very interesting patterns of brush work and color work. And sometimes you want to do this over and I'm going to do that here now, just this entire area. Give it a nice, soft, light value of that same green. So some of the white of the paper still somewhat comes through. And you could even lift a little if you wanted to give it more interest. Notice how that automatically gives it a nice atmospheric sense. If you guys could see that. And once you let this dry, it's a playground. You can come back and just rework and add to it. Without forgetting to look at the whole, because sometimes we get so focused on one little area and we overdo it. Keep your eyes on the whole structure, the whole composition, and be aware that, okay, we have some of that color right in here. That would be a good time now, maybe a little yellower, and do the same. Layering of color that we could then revisit with interesting patterns. And this is also happening here in the face. So I'm going to begin to layer some colors where I see variations in the face. Now this nose is very interesting. The way he developed the double shadow on the sides. You can always play with that. So I'm not gonna make it so straight. I'm gonna give it a little bit of curvature. And coming right up into the side nostril here, just to make it a little more, I want to say feminine, because it feels a little kind of rigid, too straight, but it's somewhat of the character. So there we are. Good setting up the colors. Just a touch of green right here. And then of course, as we build a color, We can always come back and take a quick look, get a good sense, a good read of the all over. I'm going to do something really quick. I have some warm gray, maybe a little bit of yellow ochre. Just a tiny bit, and I'm going to really, really bring down the value. So it's very light, and I'm going to apply that pretty much to this whole area, because I don't want this white to show later on. I think it's important to mute it. And when we bring the black patterns, or whatever color, I am going to go with black, the contrast would be too much, I believe. So we need to mute it somewhat to a light brownish yellow ochre color. That would kind of automatically, you see what happens. It brings this down. And as we can begin to layer some of the colors that were there just underneath, a little more yellow and a cool yellow, which is for me a lemon yellow. Much, much less value. Very nice. And I think this yellow combination here will play off really nice as I begin to build these blue and violets that are on the left side of the image. So I'm going to go with maybe a little bit heavier pigment here, a little more blue. And again, I'm going to try to do a dabbing pattern that would replicate what's at the top. Have fun with it. Create some of this visually interesting. It just attracts the eye, whether you know it or not. It does catch your attention, and you are aware that it's there. Anytime you break color and you play with it, it creates a different type of vibration. And I'm going to do some type of pattern here with these brush strokes as they get lighter and lighter. And they come somewhat up into this green area here and mix them up with a little more dab. And right into this flower arrangement here. Lighten up the value just a little bit. Add a little more cool red. Create a different type of violet that would maybe blend in better with the red flowers that are going to pop right out of there. Notice how these blues and violets really, really complement the yellows that were there before. They just mute it. They don't have any type of argument at all, working so well together with that light green. So these are the things that you begin to be aware of. Oh, look at that. Violet blue and that soft switch to the green, and how that works, how you can make it work even better. So far, I've only used one brush, but again, using different brushes, different variations of brushes, I'm going to bring in some of that bluish violet and add just a couple strokes here. And I don't want to get too carried away, because that's one of the things we were talking about earlier. When it begins to detract that simplicity, which again, we're still abiding by somewhat, we begin to lose it. Whether it's in the color scheme or the color application. If we get too carried away, and see, I'm beginning to love these layers that are starting to, as I just come up with a second layer, and this kind of work, maybe even a third layer would be just extra. Again, because of the simplicity, it would play well. It would really play well. So I'm going to go into my reds. Need to switch paper towel. And I'm going to try to maybe, let's see. I do have a yellow Naples here with a little bit of that New Gamboge. And I'm going to just touch. I have a nice rose madder. So just a touch of that. That maybe give me this, and I'll call it a flesh tone. It's a pinkish hue right here. And again, I'm going to lay it down just as a kind of local color for this area. Might be too much. So lift a little bit, but even some of these lifts look interesting. And I'm going to just define these areas of color. Especially this one here. I think this is the one that really was calling out for this. Making sure I got the color and the shape of the color. The shape that that color is filling. Again, remember to stay loose. You're not trying to do a realistic. And again, when we say the word realistic, what do we mean? We want to stay simplified in terms of brush stroke, color, and the color application. We're not trying to add any type of detail that is not necessary. Realizing that by just flattening some of these colors, and the color application of it, you have success. I have a little bit of a brown area going on here, more than an orange. It's not a reddish orange, it's more of a brown. So I'm adding a little bit of blue to the previous orange we had there, which is this side, kind of sideburn here, the side of the face. And it might just play a little bit right under the nose as well, even though I do see some reds. And this is very delicate. This has to be very delicate. Okay. Since I'm working with that nice rose madder, I'm going to really drop the value, and I'm going to just apply some of it, as you can see here, to this general area, which will leave a lot of white, not a lot, but enough white open for what comes later. This is a little more of a revisiting with the yellow ochre or the orange. I'm just going to really simplify the rest of the shapes in here. to not create too much of a contrast. And once we develop the eyes and the lips, this will just pop. And again, when we come to the second or third stage of layers and the reds that are going to be popping out of the flowers on the head, we hope we haven't gone too far. And that's why we keep this stage, and I'm keeping it a little too light maybe in some areas, but I won't know, and I usually tend to play it safer in terms of once you went too far, there's nowhere else you can go. But if I need to build it up a little further, I'd rather do one more layer and be able to play with it a little more, being maybe able to discover something that I was missing, because that would maybe mean that I was rushing. Before I head out, I want to finish up this area. I'm going to add some green to the background of these blues, and I'm going to get a little more loose and a little freer now in terms of how these colors are blending in the background, what they're beginning to do here. So notice how my brush strokes are getting a little looser, a little faster, not faster, but more confident now that I have these layers of color. I don't want to get too fast that I'm skipping or kind of just undoing the work that I just took this long to prepare. You don't want to do that. I want to introduce just a little bit of this color here as an added contrast here. I feel it needs it. And I will revisit a little bit of this red here. And I just went with turquoise for the side of the face. A nice turquoise that also runs right underneath the chin, in the neck, and my second layer right above the eye and through the side of the nose. And if you can recognize, maybe I should have used a smaller brush for this, because it kind of needs to be your refined touch there. And again, I'm setting it up for the final layer. Those strong lines. I'm talking about the eyebrows, eyes, and the lips, actually. Again, playing with patterns, adding color here and there. Because if you're working with watercolor, you're not going to be able to replicate some of the elements of paint that you see here. This is oil painting, but it's just a wonderful way for you to test out and see what you can do with these colors in a different medium. So mentally, you need to be aware, okay, it's where I want to take it, not what it's supposed to look like in terms of what the reproduction that I'm trying to create. At this point, you are taking this to the one and only place, which is where you are making all these decisions. I'm just going to add a little more blue here, which should be very surprising to you. And the one thing, it'll be what kind of thoughts in terms of planning, what kind of decisions, realizing how you made those decisions. So I am going to switch to a smaller brush, a little more detailed, thinner line in some of these areas. And I want to make sure I flow these with that easy gesture that he had going on here. So I'm preparing a little bit of, in this case, a little more pigment than I've been using all along. And since I have those somewhat guidelines, I could almost just trace them over. And already I could see that I'm liking what's happening. Remember, at this point, you are making this your own. But don't get too carried away too fast. Make slow, decisions that are not far off from where you were planning. You could still take some risks here and there. But in areas like this, when you begin to add detail, it's easy to just get carried away or stuck in just one area and develop it until, oops, you went too far. And that's what I mean. Not getting caught up, take pauses, look at the whole. Remind yourself of what we did earlier, those simple portrait lines and how you could just plan it out, pause, visualize it, and then execute it. So this one here, for example, I will have to layer because I really want this one a lot darker. So I'll let that dry for a little bit and I'll come back. Same as some of these, you want some nice, beautiful negative space and contrast between what you prepped, the color underneath, and what these shapes, these forms are doing here. And just one of the new things that you can begin to really explore is how to just, it doesn't even have to be portraits. I wanted to show you one last image as well. I think I did at the beginning, how just developing patterns in terms of what you can do with your brush and the color that's on that brush. It's amazing. And not necessarily abstract work. I believe I showed you an interior that had a mirror and a window and a still life, but it's so simplistic and it's just focus on those patterns. So I'm taking my time here, really, just to be able to capture a little bit of that gesture, the character, the expression, the subtle curvature. The description of these facial features. There we are. I'm going to retouch just one touch of black there and revisit once it's dry with a little bit of red. Because believe it or not, that touch of red that kind of bounces off the lips and lights up that nose from underneath, it's crucial. Now, the fact that I waited this long without having added the flowers that are just kind of like one of the main characters here, those red pops of color, could be risky. You know, it's one of those things where Notice how the black is overpowering now, and it just really tells this image what it's supposed to be. What happens when I add that red? Let's go ahead and do that now. So I'm going to select a warm cadmium red. I had nice layers. Ooh, I should wait a little for that black that I just laid down to dry a little, so they don't mix. You want these nice vibrant colors to stay clean. So here's the first one. Notice how it's much more saturated, but it's also because of, and I'm going to add one a little bit right here again. A little touch. And as they dry, I am mixing a little bit of this warm red with a little bit of cool. Now I could do that on the palette, or I could do it on the page, on the paper as it's still wet. So it's, you kind of get a wet on wet technique going on. Very cautious here to make sure you don't overdo it with this red as well. Making sure you get some of those beautiful shapes. And I'm adding a little more right here. And just touches, so it's interesting, not just one solid pop of color. We continue right into here. And very careful, because I see that that black might not be fully dry yet, so make sure you don't touch them. Otherwise, you'll have a little bit of a bleeding of color going on. And the one thing you really want here is that vibrancy, those colors being as vibrant as possible. Playing with patterns, not doing too much with application, because here it's a little detailed, it's small. So you can only do so much with certain types of brush strokes. I'm going to lighten up this cadmium, lighten up the value as much as I can. And I'm going to bring an extra layer. Maybe lift a little. Yep, that's beautiful. So I laid down in this area here where I had some white. It's basically the same color. And then I lifted just a touch. Very, the weight of the paper towel, basically. No pressure at all. In order for me to get some of that very light pink flower arrangement here. It's time for the lips. Now I'm doing the bottom lip with cadmium. And again, this is very delicate work here. And I am going to do the upper lip. Start it off with, at the edge, alizarin crimson. And I could mix it up with a tiny little bit of black, but I don't want to risk it. And there's a little subtle smile going on. So as I come around, oh, I like how they're mixing. And I just curve to the other edge with a little tiny smile. There we are. Now, one thing I did notice, and it could have been a mistake, is how light. And I had a feeling, if I could remind you, how when I added black, when I was I kind of pre-planned. I knew it was going to happen, that when you add black to an area like this, the black is going to overpower immediately. And I left it too light. I might have been able to maybe up it 2 or 3 values, but even though it was a mistake, it allows me a chance to go back and maybe play with some more patterns. Making sure that when that black, the black patterns are somewhat dry, so you don't have that mixing. I could maybe come back in here and I'm playing with a little bit of sepia, yellow ochre, just a little bit of leftover yellow that's on my palette, and lighten up a value just enough to see what happens when I add, and it could be really interesting actually, patterns around the black patterns that I just added here. So I'm kind of doubling that layer, and by adding patterns around the patterns, and these are brushstroke patterns, dabbing paint, squiggly brush strokes, not necessarily flat washes of color, but more, I call them dabs of color. And again, some streaks, kind of hatching would be a better word. Notice how that right away, as it dries, obviously it will be lighter, but it brings it to life. And it was better than me going too heavy or darker earlier, because then I would have been stuck with it. But I could have made a decision to, okay, I'm going to keep it that light, or like I'm doing now, darken it. And I do like that decision here. Oh gosh. Okay, so we're not finished yet, but I am looking if anyone has to leave. I have the chat open because I really, really would love to see your work, be able to comment on it if you have any questions. So I'm gonna really, really quick touch up this area here. Again, making beautiful, playful decisions with some of these patterns that you can create, maybe even mix different colors, different layers of color, and I'm doing different values of the same color. In this case, yellow ochre. And I could, again, come back with a little bit of wet on wet and see what that does with some of these dabs of paint. And I don't want to rush at this stage. I want to make much more careful, delicate decisions. And I want to, one last thing here, which is just a little bit of very light value, rose madder, right around the cheek, splitting that earlier flesh tone and that turquoise. And I'm going to add one more right here. So it kind of gives you a little bit of that cheekbone. And I'm going to dab some more of that color. And there we are. Well, stepping back, looking at it, I'm happy.